There is a key in the bottom drawer of my desk, under a stack of tax returns I never bothered to file properly, and it is the only object in my apartment I have never once let anyone else touch. It is a brass key with a rubber cap the color of a robin's egg, and it opens a blue front door on Larkspur Street that, for 11 months, only I knew was mine. I never crossed my parents' threshold and told them the truth. I never crossed my own threshold either, without checking twice that no one had followed me. That was the boundary I kept, the one I am only now able to say out loud. I owned a home of my own, free and clear of anyone's permission, and I let my family believe I was still renting a one-bedroom above a laundromat because I was afraid of what it would cost me to tell them the truth. I should start with who I am, because the order of this matters more than I once thought it did. My name is Adrienne Voss. I am 34 years old, I live in Portland, and I have spent the last 9 years working as a project manager for a mid-sized engineering firm downtown, the kind of job that pays enough to be comfortable and not enough to be careless. I grew up 40 minutes east of the city, in a split-level house on Maple Hollow Road with green shutters and a lawn my father mowed in perfect diagonal stripes every Saturday morning of my childhood, rain or shine, as if the stripes themselves were a kind of prayer. I have one brother, Dean, 2 years older than me, and 2 parents, Walter and Carol Voss, who are by any outside measure a happy, stable, unremarkable couple who raised 2 children in a good school district and never once, that I knew of, raised their voices at each other in front of us. I need you to understand that I loved them. I need you to understand that as plainly as I can, before I tell you what I hid from them and why, and what I found out in return. This is not a story about hating my parents. It is a story about a house and a ledger and how long 2 people can keep a secret from the children they were trying to protect. I should also say, because it matters for what comes later, that I am telling this in order on purpose. Not because I like the suspense of holding things back. I have had enough of holding things back to last a lifetime. But because I only understood any of it myself once I laid it out this way, beginning to end, the way it actually happened, rather than the way it felt while it was happening. So bear with me. I promise it goes somewhere. The ritual in our house was Sunday dinner, 5 o'clock sharp, and it was less a meal than a small ceremony my father presided over with a seriousness that, as a child, I mistook for love and only later understood was something closer to control. We ate at 5, because my father believed that families who ate on a schedule were families that did not fall apart, and I think some part of him genuinely believed that discipline, applied consistently enough, could keep anything terrible from ever happening to us. After dinner, while my mother cleared the plates and Dean disappeared to his room, my father would take out what we called, half jokingly, half reverently, the ledger, a black hardcover notebook, its spine cracked and retaped more than once, in which he recorded every dollar that came into or left our household. He did this at the kitchen table with a mechanical pencil he sharpened by hand. And he did it every single Sunday of my childhood that I can remember, and the ritual came with a phrase he must have said to us 1,000 times, in a tone that was never angry, only final: we don't spend what we don't have. It was less a piece of financial advice than a kind of family religion. I did not question it until I was well into my 20s. And by then, it had shaped nearly every decision I made about money without my even noticing it was shaping anything at all. There were other objects in that house that I think of now the way you think of relics, small things that meant nothing on their own, and everything in hindsight. There was a chipped blue mug, the handle glued back on twice, that only my father was allowed to drink coffee from, though he never explained why and none of us ever asked. There was a china cabinet in the dining room with a lock on its lower door, a lock for which none of us, as far as I knew, had ever seen a key, and which my mother would occasionally touch the way you touch a bruise to check if it still hurts. And there was my grandmother's wedding ring, or rather, there was the absence of it, a story my mother used to tell when I was very small, about how the ring was being resized and would be given to me one day. A story that, over the years, quietly stopped being told at all, the way a light left on in another room simply goes dark one day, and nobody remembers to ask why. I remember one Sunday in particular, the autumn I was 15, when Dean asked, half joking, whether we were secretly rich, given how carefully my father guarded every dollar. My father did not laugh the way I expected him to. He looked at Dean for a long moment, long enough that the joke curdled in the air between us, and said only, "We are exactly as rich as the ledger says we are, no more and no less," and went back to his pencil. I did not think much of it at the time. 15-year-olds rarely think much of anything that isn't about themselves. But I filed the look on his face away, the way you file away a strange expression without knowing yet that you will need it later, and it surfaced again, unbidden, years afterward, on the night everything finally came apart. I did not think about any of this as a child. I thought about it the way children think about the furniture of their lives, as fixed, as given, as simply how things were. It was only later, once I started earning my own money and trying to understand why the sight of my own bank balance made my stomach clench with something that felt indistinguishable from shame, that I began to wonder where that feeling had come from and whether it had ever really been mine. I think, looking back, that the Ledger's Sunday ritual taught me something about money before I ever earned a dollar of my own, and it is only now that I can name what that something was. It taught me that money was not simply a tool, the way it seemed to be for other families I visited as a child. Families who left cash on the counter or talked casually about vacations at the dinner table without lowering their voices. In our house, money was a subject that required a posture, a specific attentiveness, almost a reverence, the way you'd hold yourself in a doctor's waiting room, bracing gently for news that might or might not be good. I did not understand, as a child, why my stomach tightened every time my father opened that black notebook. I only understood, the way children understand things, that whatever was happening at that table mattered enormously, and that I was meant to be quiet and careful around it. The way you are quiet and careful around anything fragile enough that no one has explained to you exactly how it might break. My parents were, in most ways, generous people. My father paid for my community college tuition without complaint. My mother sewed my prom dress by hand rather than let me buy one, not because we couldn't afford a dress, but because, she said, a handmade thing holds more love in it than a bought one, and I believed her. And I still believe her, actually. Even now. But underneath the generosity there was always a current of anxiety about money that never had a name and was never allowed to be discussed directly. If I mentioned wanting something, a better winter coat, a trip with friends, later, as an adult, a nicer apartment, my father's face would do a particular thing, a kind of tightening around the eyes, and he would say something mild, something reasonable sounding like maybe we wait and see, or is that really necessary, and the conversation would end there. Because in our family, that was where conversations about money always ended. Not in a fight, in a door quietly and permanently closed. I moved out of Maple Hollow Road at 22 into a shared apartment near my first job. And I want to be honest and say that for the first several years of my independence, I lived the way I had been raised to live, which is to say carefully, almost fearfully, saving a portion of every paycheck into an account I did not touch and did not talk about, because talking about money, in my family, was its own kind of nakedness. I did not think of this as strange. I thought of it as responsible. It was Priya, my closest friend at work, who first said it out loud to me on a Thursday afternoon 3 years ago, over the kind of bad office coffee that somehow tastes worse the longer you've worked somewhere. She had asked, casually, what I was doing with my savings, whether I was thinking about buying instead of renting, the way half our coworkers seemed to be doing that year, and I remember the reflexive tightness that rose in my own chest, uninvited, entirely inherited, before I even answered her. I don't really talk about that stuff, I told her, and she looked at me for a second too long, the way a good friend does when she's deciding whether to push. Why not? She said. It's just numbers, Adrienne. It's not a confession. I laughed it off, the way I laughed off a lot of things back then, but the question stayed lodged in me the way certain questions do, quietly working themselves loose over months instead of days. I went home that night and, for the first time in my adult life, opened my savings account and actually looked at the number, really looked at it, instead of glancing at it sideways the way I usually did. The way you glance at something you've been told is dangerous to look at directly. And the number surprised me. 9 years of careful, almost punishing frugality had left me with more than I expected, more than enough, according to the mortgage calculator I opened at 11 that night, with my heart going strangely fast, to put a real down payment on a real house of my own. I did not tell anyone that night. I did not tell anyone for a long time. But something in me had shifted, quietly, the way a hairline crack shifts in a foundation long before anyone notices the wall has moved. I want to be fair to my parents here, because it would be easy, in telling this story, to make them into villains, and they were not villains. They were two people who had built a particular kind of safety for their children out of a particular kind of vigilance, and I understood, even then. Even as the vigilance began to feel less like safety and more like a cage I had been given at birth and never thought to test the bars of, that the vigilance came from somewhere. I just didn't yet know where. What I knew was this: in my family, big financial decisions were not private matters. They were family matters, discussed at the kitchen table, under the mild but unmistakable authority of my father's ledger and my father's phrase, "We don't spend what we don't have," and I understood, without ever being told outright, that if I came to that table and said I want to buy a house, the conversation would not be a celebration. It would be an inquisition. It would be my father asking, gently, reasonably, unbearably, whether I had really thought this through, whether I understood what a mortgage meant, whether I was being impulsive, whether I had considered renting a little longer just to be safe, and somewhere in the middle of all that gentle, reasonable, loving concern, I knew I would start to doubt myself. I had watched exactly this happen to Dean 3 years earlier, and I think of that Sunday often, because it is the clearest picture I have of what I was afraid of becoming. Dean had come to dinner that night practically vibrating, the way he used to get as a boy on Christmas morning, and he'd waited until dessert to tell us. He wanted to leave his safe, forgettable job managing inventory at a hardware distributor and start a small woodworking business out of our uncle's garage, building custom furniture, the kind of work he'd been quietly teaching himself on weekends for 2 years by then, filling our mother's garage with sawdust and half-finished chairs no one but him seemed to notice. He had numbers. He had a business plan, printed and stapled, that he set on the table like an offering. My father read 3 pages of it in silence, then set it down, and began, gently, reasonably, to ask questions. How many custom orders did Dean actually have lined up? What would he do for health insurance? What happened if the first year was slow? Had he considered that people don't spend impulse money on furniture the way they spend it on other things? Wouldn't it be wiser to keep the steady job and build the business on the side first? Just to be safe. None of the questions were unfair. Exactly. Each one, taken alone, was the kind of question a careful person might ask. But question by patient question, I watched my brother's excitement fold in on itself like a tent losing its poles, until by the time my mother started clearing plates, Dean was nodding along, agreeing that yes, maybe the side business approach made more sense. Yes, maybe next year. And he never brought the business plan to that table again. I do not think my father meant to do what he did that night. I think he believed, entirely sincerely, that he was protecting his son from a mistake. But I sat across from Dean that whole evening, watching something leave his face that I never saw fully return, and I promised myself, quietly, driving home afterward, that whatever large thing I ever wanted to do with my life, I would find a way to have already done it before anyone got the chance to talk me out of it. I loved my father. I was also, I now admit, afraid of him. In the specific and unglamorous way, you are afraid of someone who has never once hit you and never needs to. It is a strange, quiet kind of fear to carry into adulthood, one that doesn't announce itself the way other fears do. It doesn't make your hands shake or your voice catch. It just makes you very good, very early, at rehearsing a version of your own life that will sound acceptable before you ever say it out loud to the person whose approval you were trained, without ever agreeing to it, to need. So I decided, sometime in that first autumn after the conversation with Priya, that if I was going to do this, if I was actually going to buy a house, I was going to do it entirely on my own, and I was not going to tell them until it was already done. Not out of spite, out of self-preservation. I wanted, for once in my life, to make a large decision about my own money without anyone else's hand steadying or steering mine, Priya noticed before anyone in my family did. Which I suppose is only natural, since she was the one who had planted the question in me to begin with. About 4 months into my search, she caught me at my desk on a Saturday-brained Monday morning, eyes red from a late night of scrolling listings, and she said, not unkindly, "You've been weird lately." "Good weird. Are you seeing someone?" I laughed, too quickly, and said, "No, nothing like that, just busy." And she raised an eyebrow in the particular way she has, the one that means she doesn't believe you, and is deciding whether the friendship can survive her saying so out loud. She let it go that day. But a few weeks later, she saw a mortgage pre-approval email open on my monitor before I could minimize it, and she didn't say anything right away, just looked at me across the cubicle wall with an expression that was somewhere between delighted and hurt. "Adrienne," she said, carefully, "are you buying a house?" I remember the specific way my stomach dropped, the reflex of a lifetime kicking in before I'd even decided what to say. I told her, half true, that I was just looking, that nothing was decided, that I didn't want to make a big deal out of something that might not even happen. She let me have that answer, because she is a good friend, and good friends know when to let a door stay closed a little longer, but she said one more thing before she went back to her monitor, and it stayed with me for weeks afterward. "Whatever you're not telling me," she said, "I hope it's because you're excited, and not because you're scared." I didn't answer her. I think my silence was answer enough, and I think she knew it. And I have always been grateful that she let me keep the rest to myself a little longer, even as she made sure I knew she'd noticed. What followed was nearly a year of a strange kind of double life, the only real secret I have ever kept from anyone I loved. I met with a mortgage broker on my lunch breaks, in a coffee shop 3 blocks from my office where I knew none of my coworkers went. I toured houses on Saturday mornings, telling my mother when she called that I was busy with errands, which was not, strictly speaking, a lie, though it was not the truth either. I toured 11 houses that year before I found the right one, and I remember most of them only in fragments now. A kitchen with avocado green countertops nobody had bothered to replace since the 70s. A basement that smelled faintly and permanently of mildew, no matter how many times the listing agent insisted it had been fully remediated. A lovely little craftsman 2 streets from my office that I loved instantly and lost within 4 days to a cash offer from a couple who, the agent told me apologetically, hadn't even bothered with an inspection. I cried a little in my car after that one, in the parking lot of a grocery store, not because the house itself had been so extraordinary, but because losing it made the whole secret project suddenly feel real in a way it hadn't before, real enough to hurt, real enough that I understood for the first time how much I actually wanted this, wanted something that was entirely, unshakably mine. I found the house on Larkspur Street on a rainy Tuesday in March, a small blue 2-bedroom bungalow with a crooked porch step and a kitchen window that looked out onto an overgrown lilac bush. A house that needed work, and was, for exactly that reason, within what I could afford. And I remember standing in its empty living room with the real estate agent chattering somewhere behind me about the roof's age, and feeling something I can only describe as a held breath finally letting go. I want to tell you about the day I signed the papers, because it is one of the strangest, loneliest, most triumphant days of my life, and those 3 things had never before occurred to me as compatible. I sat in a title company's fluorescent lit conference room signing document after document with a pen that ran out of ink halfway through and had to be replaced, and there was no one there with me, no mother squeezing my hand, no father proud despite himself, no dean cracking a joke to cut the tension, just me, and a title officer named Grace, who was kind enough to notice, at the end, that I looked like I might cry, and who said, gently, first house. And I said yes, and she said, congratulations, sweetheart, you did that, and something about a stranger saying you did that undid me more than any of the rest of it had. I moved in over a long weekend in April, hiring movers instead of asking Dean to help the way I normally would have. Because I could not yet think of a lie good enough to explain a new address, and because some small, self-protective part of me was not ready to watch my brother's face do whatever it might do upon learning I'd managed, quietly, the very thing our father had once talked him out of even trying. The movers were 2 brothers named Hector and Ray. Cheerful and fast and entirely uninterested in the significance of the day, and I remember feeling a strange loneliness, watching them carry my life up the crooked porch step in cardboard boxes, wishing, even as I'd engineered the secrecy myself, that there was someone there to see it who actually knew what it meant. That first night, once the movers had gone, and the house had gone quiet in the particular way an empty house goes quiet, full of settling sounds I didn't yet recognize as my own, I sat on the bare floor of what would become my bedroom with a bottle of grocery store champagne I'd bought on impulse and no one to share it with, and I poured a single glass and toasted, out loud, to an empty room. I remember thinking it was a slightly pathetic image, if anyone could have seen it, a grown woman alone on a floor with cardboard boxes, celebrating by herself, and I remember deciding, in the same breath, that I did not care, that it was still a celebration, that it counted even with no witnesses. I stood in that empty new bedroom that first night, boxes still taped shut around me, looking up at a ceiling that belonged to no one but me, and I felt a happiness so large and so illegal feeling that I actually laughed out loud, alone, in the dark, at nothing. For the better part of a year, I lived 2 versions of my own life. On Sundays, I drove to Maple Hollow Road, ate dinner at 5 o'clock sharp, listened to my father read out figures from the ledger the way another man might read scripture, and said nothing about the blue house 40 minutes away that was entirely, terrifyingly, wonderfully mine. I told my mother, when she asked, that my apartment lease had been renewed. I told Dean, when he offered to help me move a bookshelf, that I'd already handled it. I got very good, that year, at a particular kind of quiet, not lying outright, but arranging the truth so carefully around its edges that no one would trip over it by accident. There was a particular Sunday in late summer that I still think about. Months after I'd already closed on the house and quietly moved my life into it, when my mother mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd driven past a for sale sign near her hairdresser's and thought, unprompted, of me, wondered aloud whether I'd ever consider a neighborhood like that one, whether I was saving anything at all these days, whether I had a plan beyond just renting forever. I remember the strange vertigo of sitting there, my own key to my own front door in my purse, not 3 feet from her elbow, nodding along and saying something non-committal about how renting had its advantages, flexibility, no maintenance costs, all the sentences I had once genuinely believed and now recited like lines from a play I no longer wanted a part in. I drove home to Larkspur Street that evening with the windows down, and I remember laughing, once, alone in the car, at the absurdity of it, a grown woman speeding home to a house her own mother didn't know existed, having just spent an hour being gently, lovingly interrogated about whether she had any plans at all. I want to be honest that the secrecy cost me something, even as it also gave me something. There were small dishonesties that accumulated the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a river, invisible day to day, and enormous in aggregate. I missed my mother's birthday lunch once because a plumber was coming to fix a leak under my new kitchen sink, and I told her I had a work deadline instead. And I remember the specific discomfort of hearing the disappointment in her voice on the phone. Disappointment I had caused and could have erased with a single sentence I did not let myself say. I stopped inviting friends from the neighborhood over for anything, for fear word would somehow travel the 40 minutes back to Maple Hollow Road the way small-town gossip travels even across a city that isn't technically small at all. I became, for that year, a slightly smaller, more careful version of myself, and I told myself it was temporary. A toll I was paying for a freedom I'd get to enjoy fully later, once the telling finally happened on my own terms. There was one Sunday, in the middle of that long secret year, when I came very close to telling them anyway, and I think about that evening almost as often as I think about the one that eventually broke everything open. It was in June, 3 weeks after I'd closed on the house but before I'd moved a single box into it, and my mother had asked, over dessert in the mild, curious way she asked most things, whether I'd thought any more about buying someday, the way young people your age seem to be doing now. I remember setting down my fork very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid of dropping, and thinking, this is it, this is the moment. I could simply say yes, I already have, it's done. I could feel the sentence sitting right at the back of my teeth. And then my father, without even looking up from the ledger he'd already opened at the end of the table, said, buying's a big decision. You'd want to run the numbers a long time before you did something like that. Plenty of time to be sure, and I watched the sentence I'd been about to say quietly dissolve, the way sugar dissolves in something too hot to hold. I said, maybe someday, and passed the potatoes, and told myself, driving home that night, that I had simply chosen a better time. A calmer time. A time when the news would land the way I wanted it to land instead of getting folded immediately into a lecture about numbers I had already, privately, run 100 times more carefully than he could have imagined. I did not tell myself the truer thing, which was that I had tested the door and found it, once again, still locked, and had decided, for one more season, that it was easier to keep my key in my own pocket. It could not last, of course. Secrets like that don't stay contained, they just wait for the right room to be born in. The room, it turned out, was my mother's 60th birthday in February, which the family had decided, as families do, deserved something bigger than the usual Sunday ritual, a proper dinner at a restaurant downtown, followed by cake back at the house, my father's one concession to occasion. I remember standing in my parents' kitchen that evening, holding a slice of cake I didn't particularly want, listening to my mother tell a story about her own mother, my grandmother, and the two of them laughing in the specific way women laugh when a memory is both funny and sad at the same time, and something about the warmth of the room, the ordinary, sturdy love of it, made the weight of my secret suddenly unbearable in a way it had not been. Unbearable in the coffee shops or the empty living rooms or the long solitary drives back to Larkspur Street. I did not plan to say anything that night. I want to be honest about that. It simply rose up out of me, the way water rises when you've been holding a lid down on it for longer than the lid was built to hold. I bought a house, I said into a small lull in the conversation, and the room went the particular kind of quiet that feels louder than noise. My mother's face did something complicated, surprise, then a flicker of hurt, quickly buried, that I recognized because I have the same reflex myself. Dean laughed once, disbelieving, and said, "Wait, what? When?" And I told them, the blue house, the lilac bush, the crooked porch step. 10 months of secrecy I tried to make sound practical instead of frightened. And then I looked at my father. My father had gone very still, the particular stillness he got when the ledger's numbers didn't add up the way he expected, and he asked, in a voice that was trying very hard to be mild, "How? Exactly. On your salary." And I understood, even as I answered him, that this was the question underneath all the other questions he would ask that night, not disapproval of the house itself, but a kind of disbelief that I had managed a thing this large without his oversight, without his ledger, without his permission. I told him about the savings, the years of it, careful and unglamorous, the mortgage broker, the numbers I had run a dozen times before I trusted them. And my father, instead of the pride I had, somewhere beneath my fear, still hoped for, said something I did not expect at all. He said, "You shouldn't have done that without talking to us first," and his voice cracked slightly on the word us, in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with something else. Something I did not yet have a name for, and my mother reached over and put her hand flat on his arm, the way you steady someone who has started to sway, and said, "Quietly, Walter." And in the way she said his name, in the particular tightness of her mouth as she said it, I understood, for the first time in my life, that I had just walked into a room whose walls were not what I had always believed them to be. I asked what was wrong, and for a long moment neither of them answered, and Dean, who had gone very quiet beside me, was looking between our parents with an expression I had never seen on his face before. The look of someone realizing, in real time, that he too had been standing his whole life on a floor he'd never been told was hollow. My mother started clearing the dessert plates, an old reflex, busying her hands the way she always did when a room got too heavy for her to sit still inside it, and my father stood by the counter with the chipped blue mug in his hand, though there was no coffee in it, just his fingers wrapped around the handle the way you'd hold on to something in a current. Dean said, quietly, "Somebody needs to just say it," and I remember being grateful to him for saying it, because I don't think I would have found the nerve myself, not that night. Not with the 10 months of my own hiding still fresh enough that I felt in no position to demand anyone else's honesty. My mother set the plates down. She didn't look at my father when she spoke, she looked at the two of us, at Dean and me, the way you look at children even when they are 30 and 32 years old." And she said, "We should have told you this a long time ago, and I want you to know we did what we did because we loved you, not because we didn't trust you." "Told us what?" Dean said, and there was an edge in his voice I had rarely heard directed at either of them. It was my mother who finally spoke, her hand still on my father's arm, her voice low in the way voices go low when they are about to say something that has been unsaid for a very long time. She said, "There's something we should have told you both a long time ago, and I want you to understand that we did what we did to protect you." And I remember thinking, with a strange lurch of recognition, that I had said almost exactly the same thing to myself 100 times about my own secret over the past 10 months. What followed was not, in the end, dramatic in the way discoveries are dramatic in movies. There was no shouting, no slammed door, nothing so clean as a single sentence that changed everything. It came out slowly, painfully, in pieces, the way true things usually do. Over the rest of that evening and eventually over several more conversations across the following weeks, and I am going to tell it to you the way I eventually understood it. In order, rather than the confused, backward way I actually received it that night. In 2009, the year I was 17, my father's small commercial printing business, the business that had, for as long as I could remember, quietly funded our comfortable, disciplined, unremarkable life, nearly collapsed. I remembered, vaguely, that there had been a difficult year around then, remembered my father coming home later than usual, remembered a tension in the house I had chalked up, at 17, to ordinary teenage self-absorption, my own dramas simply crowding out theirs. What I had not known, what none of us children had ever been told, was how close the business had come to failing entirely, or what it had cost my parents to keep our house, our school district, our green shutters and diagonal lawn stripes intact through it. They had refinanced Maple Hollow Road that year, not once, but twice, the second time against my father's better judgment. On terms my mother described, all these years later, with a wince that told me exactly how bad those terms had been. They had sold my grandmother's wedding ring, the one that was supposedly being resized, to a jeweler in the city, quietly. On a weekday, my mother took off work without explanation and used the money to cover 3 months of a mortgage payment that would otherwise have gone unpaid. They had locked the lower door of the china cabinet not to protect anything valuable inside it, but because it was where they kept the paperwork, the letters from the bank, the second mortgage documents, the things they could not bear for 2 curious children to stumble across while looking for a spare tablecloth. And the ledger, the ritual I had spent my whole life believing was simply my father's particular brand of discipline, his particular kind of love, had begun that year, in 2009, not as a philosophy, but as a lifeline, a desperate, exacting attempt by a frightened man to make sure that nothing like that would ever be allowed to happen to his family again, even if it meant, and here my father's voice did break. Finally, fully, that his children grew up believing frugality was a kind of virtue rather than what it actually was, which was fear, worn for so many years it had calcified into a personality. "We don't spend what we don't have," my father said that night, quietly, looking at his own hands rather than at either of us, "was never really advice for you. It was a promise I made to myself after we almost lost everything, and I said it to you kids so many times I think I forgot, somewhere along the way, that you were never the ones who needed to hear it." And here is the part that undid me most, the part I have turned over more times than any other since that February evening. The mortgage on Maple Hollow Road. The house I had grown up believing was simply, solidly, permanently ours, the way a childhood home is supposed to be, was not in fact paid off. It had never been paid off. My parents had been quietly refinancing it, restructuring it, managing it in careful, invisible increments for 17 years, presenting to their children and to nearly everyone else in their lives an image of stability that was, underneath, still being paid for, still being managed, still, in some sense, still owed. My mother said, and I believe her, that they had always intended to tell us once it was finally, truly resolved, once there was nothing left to explain, but the resolution kept receding, the way a debt does, a little further every year, until telling us started to feel not like relief but like confession. And confession, in our family, it turned out, was something both generations of us had been avoiding in exactly the same way, for exactly the same reason, without either side ever knowing the other was doing it too. I did not know what to say, that night, for a long time. I remember looking at my mother's bare left hand. She had stopped wearing her own wedding ring years before, something I had noticed and never once thought to ask about. Assuming, in the incurious way children assume things about their parents' habits, that it simply didn't fit anymore, and understanding, all at once, a decade of small, unexplained absences in that house, each one a piece of a story none of us had been allowed to read. I want to tell you honestly that my first feeling, underneath the shock, was something close to relief, though it took me weeks to admit that to myself, let alone to them. Relief, because the anxious, watchful, money-flinching parts of me that I had spent so long being quietly ashamed of suddenly made a different kind of sense. I had not simply been raised carefully. I had been raised inside a fear so large and so carefully hidden that it had transferred itself to me anyway. The way certain things pass between people, whether or not they are ever spoken aloud, a kind of inheritance neither of us had chosen, and neither of us had known we were passing along. The following weeks were quieter than I expected, and harder in a different way than I expected. There was no single dramatic reconciliation, no scene where everything was suddenly and completely understood. There were instead a series of smaller conversations. My mother and I sat at her kitchen table one Tuesday afternoon, at her request, going through the box of old bank letters that had lived behind the locked door of the china cabinet for 17 years. The two of us reading them together for the first time, her narrating in a flat, careful voice what each one had meant at the time. The way you'd narrate an old photograph to someone who wasn't there. There was a letter dated that October, on bank letterhead gone soft and gray with age, informing them of the second refinance's approval, and my mother held it for a long moment before setting it down, saying only, "I remember exactly where I was standing when this came in the mail." I didn't ask where. I didn't think I needed to. My father and I had our real conversation on his back porch one evening in March, both of us looking out at the lawn instead of at each other, the diagonal mower stripes long since grown out and gone shaggy in the dusk. He told me, haltingly, in a voice I had never once heard him use, about the specific week in 2009 when he had genuinely believed they would lose the house. The phone calls he hadn't returned, the invoice he'd quietly stopped paying a vendor in order to make payroll for his 3 employees, the night he had gone into my room while I slept, 17 years old and utterly unaware, and stood in the doorway for a long time, trying, he said, to memorize it in case it stopped being ours. I asked him why he'd never told any of us, not even once it was over. Not even years later, when the worst of it had clearly passed, and he was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer at all. "Because telling you would have meant admitting it could happen again," he said finally. "And I didn't think I could survive you looking at me the way I looked at my own father once, when his hardware store went under and he had to ask my mother's family for money. I swore I'd never let my kids see that look on my face. I just didn't understand until you stood in my kitchen and told me about that house, that keeping you from seeing it meant keeping you from understanding me at all. I did not know, until that evening, that my father had watched his own father lose something the way he had nearly lost Maple Hollow Road, and I understood, sitting there in the fading light, that the ledger, the phrase, the locked cabinet, all of it, had never really been about me or Dean at all. It had been my father's lifelong argument with his own father's ghost, conducted at our kitchen table every Sunday for 17 years, and we had simply been the audience he needed in order to keep making it. I sat with that for a long time after he'd gone quiet again, watching the porch light attract the first moths of the season, and I found myself, oddly, grieving a version of my childhood that had never actually existed, a version where the ledger really had just been discipline, uncomplicated by fear, and I understood that I was allowed to grieve that imagined, simpler version, even while being grateful for the more complicated, truer one I actually had. I told him, on that porch, about the coffee shop meetings with the mortgage broker, about touring houses in secret on Saturday mornings, about the year of careful, frightened lying I had done to protect a decision I was terrified he would talk me out of the way he had talked Dean out of the woodworking business years before. I watched something in his face fall, and then, slowly, settle into something gentler. "I did that to you," he said, "not on purpose. But I did." I don't think either of us fully forgave the other that evening, if forgiveness is even the right word for what passed between us, but something did shift. The particular relief of two people who have each been carrying a version of the same secret, finally setting it down at the same table and discovering it was, all along, more or less the same weight. I went back to a few of the old motifs in my mind in the weeks that followed, the way you go back and reread a book once you know how it ends. The chipped blue mug, I learned, had been a gift from my grandmother the year she gave my parents the down payment for Maple Hollow Road, and my father drank from it every Sunday, I think now, the way some people keep a small stone in their pocket. Not out of superstition exactly, but out of a private, unspoken need to touch the memory of a debt he was still, in his own way, still repaying. I asked him, one Sunday not long after, whether he'd ever thought about simply buying a new mug, since the glue on the handle was failing again, visibly, a thin white seam threatening to give way entirely. And he looked at it in his hand for a moment and said, "I've thought about it every year for 17 years, and every year I decide I'm not done needing it yet, and I understood that I was not really being told about a mug at all." The locked cabinet door I had already understood, mostly, though my mother told me one more small thing about it that I hadn't known. That the lock itself had been my father's, salvaged from the hardware store that failed, one of the only things of his own father's my father had kept, and that some part of him, locking those bank letters behind it every year, had been quietly, wordlessly telling his father's memory that this time it would hold. And the ring I never received, the one I had been half-jokingly promised as a child, my mother, in one of our kitchen table conversations, told me she had gone back to the same jeweler 3 years ago now, quietly, on her own, without telling my father, and bought back a ring that was close enough in design, though not the original, and had been keeping it in a drawer ever since. Waiting for an occasion she could not quite name, afraid that giving it to me would require explaining where the first one had gone. She gave it to me that afternoon, finally, without ceremony, sliding a small box across the table the way you'd pass someone a set of keys rather than a gift, and said, "It isn't the real one." "I know," I told her, turning it over once in my palm before I put it on, feeling the specific, unglamorous weight of it settle against my finger. "It's the one that's real now. That's what matters." She was quiet for a moment, watching me look at it, And then she said something I have not been able to stop thinking about since. I kept telling myself I was waiting for the right time to give it to you, she said. But I think I was really just waiting to see whether you'd turn out to be the kind of person who could forgive me for the wrong ones. I told her I already had. I am not sure, even now, that either of us fully believed me, but I think we both understood that the saying of it mattered more, in that moment, than whether it was entirely, perfectly true yet. There was one more conversation I want to tell you about, because it is the one that in the end changed the least on the surface and the most underneath. It was Dean who suggested it, the three of us, sitting together in the living room on Maple Hollow Road on an ordinary Thursday evening. No birthday, no occasion. My father with his ledger closed on the coffee table between us for once, instead of open on the kitchen table where it always lived. I remember Dean's hands, restless, in his lap, the way they used to be restless before he'd shown any of us his sanded smooth chair legs for the first time, years ago, hopeful and terrified in equal measure. Dean asked our father, plainly, whether the woodworking business he'd talked him out of 3 years earlier had really been about the numbers, or about something else, and my father was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that I found myself holding my breath the way I imagined Dean was holding his, before he said, honestly, both, I think. The numbers were real. I wasn't lying about the risk. But I think I was also protecting myself from watching you try something I never let myself try, and worrying it would remind me of everything I gave up to keep this house standing. I'm sorry it took me this long to know the difference. Dean didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, quietly, I still have the business plan, you know. It's in a drawer in my apartment. I look at it sometimes. My father nodded and said, I'd like to see it again, if you ever want to show me, not so I can tell you what's wrong with it, just so I can see it. Nothing was fixed in that single exchange. Not really. Dean has not started the woodworking business since, and I don't know if he ever will, and some part of me suspects the fear my father passed to him will take longer to loosen than the fear he passed to me, because Dean's version of it wears the shape of a whole abandoned life rather than a single secret year. But something had been named plainly, finally, out loud, that none of us had ever been able to say before at that table, and I have come to believe that the naming mattered more, in the end, than any tidy resolution would have. As for me and the house on Larkspur Street, I did not sell it, and I did not move back into some easier, more legible version of my life to make anyone more comfortable. The way some part of me, in the rawest days right after the birthday party, had almost feared I might feel pressured to do. As if owning something so entirely mine had somehow been the offense, rather than the hiding of it. I invited my parents over for the first time on a Sunday in April, a year almost to the day after I'd first moved in, and for once, in this house at least. The ritual belonged to me. I set the table myself. I cooked the meal myself, at my own pace, at my own hour, 5:30 instead of 5, just to see, quietly, privately, whether the world would end if we started a little late. And it did not. My mother walked through every room slowly, the way she walks through anywhere new, touching the door frames, commenting on the light. My father was quieter, and I watched him stand for a long moment at my kitchen window, looking out at the overgrown lilac bush I still hadn't gotten around to trimming, his hands loose at his sides instead of reaching, out of habit, for a pen or a notebook that wasn't there. This is a good house, Adrian, he said, finally, not turning around. And there was something in the particular quiet way he said my name, the way he let the sentence sit by itself without following it with a single question about square footage or interest rates or resale value, that I understood. From him, as close to an apology and a blessing at once as he was ever likely to manage. I did not ask him to say more. I have learned, this past year, that some sentences are complete exactly as they are, and that asking a person to say more than they are able to is its own small, unnecessary cruelty. It was enough. I let it be enough. We ate at my table that evening until the light went from gold to blue outside the kitchen window, and at some point my father took out his phone, not the ledger, and asked me, almost shyly, whether I'd send him a few pictures of the renovation I'd mentioned wanting to do to the back porch, because he thought he might have some old tools in the garage that could help if I wanted the company some Saturday. I said yes before I'd even fully considered it, and I understood, watching him nod and look almost pleased with himself, that this, a father offering his hands instead of his doubts, was its own kind of ledger entry, the first one either of us had made in this new, more honest column. I have thought a great deal, since that February evening, about what it means that two people in the same family can each spend years protecting the other from a truth, believing all the while that they alone are the one keeping the secret, when really the house itself is full of quiet locked doors, each one hiding something someone loved enough to be afraid of losing. I don't think my parents were wrong to protect us from their fear, exactly. Though I think they might have protected us less and trusted us more. I don't think I was wrong to protect my own decision from their doubt, though I understand now that the doubt I was so afraid of was never really about me at all. It was the sound of a much older fear, wearing my father's voice, still trying, 17 years later, to keep something from being lost. What I know now, that I did not know the night I stood alone in my empty new bedroom laughing at nothing in the dark, is that a house is never really just a house, in a family like mine, or maybe in any family. It is a ledger of its own kind, keeping track of everything that was risked to keep it standing, and sometimes the truest inheritance a parent passes down is not the property itself, but the quiet, complicated fear of losing it, and the only way out of that inheritance, I think, is the plain, unglamorous, terrifying act of finally saying the number out loud at the same table together. I still have the key in the bottom drawer of my desk, under the tax returns I still haven't properly filed, though these days I don't think of it as evidence of anything I need to hide. I think of it, instead, as the first thing I ever built entirely with my own two hands and my own careful, inherited fear. And then chose, deliberately, to keep anyway, in spite of that fear, rather than because of it. My father still keeps his ledger. He showed it to me not long ago, actually, flipped it open on my own kitchen table one Sunday evening and pointed, without any of the old solemnity, to a new page near the back, one he'd started the same month we finally told each other everything. It isn't a record of fear anymore, as far as I can tell. It's just numbers now, the way Priya always insisted they should have been all along. Some habits outlive the reasons we built them, I think, and become, quietly, something gentler instead. I do not know exactly what I will tell my own children, someday, about money, or about fear, or about the particular ways love and secrecy can look identical from the inside of a family, until someone finally has the courage to hold them up to the light and ask which one they actually are. But I know I will try to tell them sooner than my parents told me, and I know I will try to listen, the way I wish someone had listened to me a little earlier, before I ever needed a key I had to hide. Sometimes, on ordinary Sundays now, I drive out to Maple Hollow Road the way I always did. And the dinners still happen, mostly at 5 o'clock, because some rituals are worth keeping even after you've understood their true origin, and I think that is its own kind of lesson too, that a habit born from fear can be kept, deliberately, for a gentler reason once the fear has finally been named and set down. My father still mows the lawn in diagonal stripes. I asked him once, recently, half joking, whether the stripes meant anything either, and he laughed, actually laughed, in a way I hadn't heard in years, and said, "No, Adrian, sometimes a stripe is just a stripe." And I laughed too, grateful, for once, that not every object in that house needed to be a locked door. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.